Hey guys, so today I'm here with the Teraflex 2.5-inch ST2 suspension lift kit with 2.1 Falcon monotube shocks fitting all 2018 and newer 4-door JL Wranglers. So adding a lift to your Wrangler or upgrading your suspension can offer you a number of different benefits, including leveling out the rake in your hood and creating a more aggressive stance. It's also going to add some performance for the trail, some very comfortable street driving, while also opening up a lot of room in the wheel well for larger wheels and tires. So this lift kit by Teraflex is going to do all of that, and it's also going to be a very inclusive kit that comes with everything that you need to accomplish a mild height on your JL. So this is going to come with a high performance shock. It's also going to come with front lower control arms to make sure that you don't get any weird driving characteristics once you have lifted your Wrangler and kind of screwed up your caster angles. And this is also going to do a really good job at creating a perfect blend between street and trail performance. So like I said, this is going to be a very inclusive kit, and it is going to come with all of the odds and ends that you need to get that height on your Wrangler and even accommodate for a couple of different tire sizes. Now, speaking of tire sizes, on a Sport and a Sahara, this is going to accommodate up to a 35-inch tire. And as for the Rubicon with the higher fender flare, you will be able to fit on a 37-inch tire. So as for 33s on all three models, they may look a little bit small in the wheel well, but they're going to give you a lot of room for more up travel and articulation off-road. Now for the Sport and the Sahara, I would recommend a 35-inch tire. However, if you do put on a 37, this does come with the bump stops in order to accommodate for that larger tire size, but you may get some rubbing from wheel lock to wheel lock, and you may have tire to fender contact if you don't put on those bump stop extensions. Now, as for a 35-inch tire on a Rubicon, it may be the same case for a 33-inch tire on the Sport and the Sahara. They may look a little bit smaller, however, you're still gonna get a lot of room in the wheel well for better articulation. So as for the Sport and Sahara, a 35-inch tire is recommended, and as for the Rubicon, you will be able to fit up to a 37-inch tire, but a 35-inch tire is still recommended in my book. So as far as price goes, this is going to be roughly $1,600, which puts it at a higher price point. However, I think that's definitely justified for what's included in the kit. Now, when you take a look at lift kits all across the page, you are going to see lift kits that are on the cheaper or more cost-effective side, and they're not really going to include a lot of components. They may be for spacers or just include the bare bones kit. And on the other side, those more expensive options, including this, are going to include a lot more components and make sure that you're really getting everything that you need to get all of that height on your Wrangler and also accommodate for all of that height in the meantime. So this is going to fall into one of those kits. This is going to come with everything that you need, and it's also going to give you some high quality performance for the street and the trail, like I mentioned before. So I think for $1,600, you're really getting your money's worth out of this lift kit. And not to mention, Teraflex is a very high quality brand, and they put a lot of thought into their components as far as the design goes. So overall, $1,600, I think, again, you're definitely getting your money's worth. So install is going to be a 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. This will probably take you a day to get this done in your driveway with some pretty basic hand tools. So speaking of the install, let's jump into that now. The tools that I used for my install were a small and a large pry bar, a trim removal tool, an impact wrench, electric and pneumatic, a drill, a dead blow, a step bit, a 1/2-inch drill bit, a 10-inch extension, a 5-inch extension, a 1/2-inch drive and 3/8-inch drive ratchet, a air ratchet, a cutoff wheel, 15/16, 13/16, 3/4, 19mm and 18mm open-ended wrench, pair of channel locks, pair of needle nose pliers, pair of vice grips, a couple different sizes of flathead screwdrivers, impact sockets, deep and shallow, chrome sockets, deep and shallow, as well as a 6mm Allen socket. So the first step to this lift kit is to get your Jeep up in the air, whether it be on a jack and jack stands or on a lift like we have it, and then you want to go ahead and take off the wheels. Now, we are going to be starting in the front, so if you are on a jack and jack stand, jack up the front of your Wrangler and then take off the front wheels and make sure you chock the back. Then we can go ahead and support the axle. Since we're on a lift here, I have 2 pole jacks, but if you're on the ground, you want to go ahead and support it with jack stands, and then we can go ahead and take off our sway bar end links. So I'm going to be using an 18mm deep socket and an 18mm wrench to do that. So what we can do is do the same thing on the other side. I am going to be using a swivel socket just because there's not a lot of room over here with the drag link and the tie rod, but it is going to be an 18mm. We also don't need the wrench because this is going to have a flag nut on the other side. then we can move our sway bar down so we can access the top stud. So now we can move up to the top of our sway bar end link. I did want to remove the 2 bottom bolts first, just so we could swing our sway bar out of the way of our frame side track bar bracket. But I am going to use a 6mm Allen socket to hold the stud still and an 18mm wrench to take off the nut there. After our sway bar end links are detached, what we can do is remove our axle side track bar bolt using a 21mm socket. And I'm also using a 5-inch extension just to clear our drag link. So our next step is to remove our lower shock bolt. I'm going to be using an 18mm socket and wrench. You might want to put a little bit of pressure on the axle just to make sure that that shock bolt comes loose. So I'm just going to use my swivel socket to remove the rest of the bolt. All right, now we can move to the upper bolt. So our next step is to remove the upper shock bolt. I did peel back the inner fender liner a little bit because we do have to clear that bolt. I'm going to use an 18mm swivel socket to remove that bolt up there. After that bolt's removed, what we can do is just remove our shock and do the same thing on the other side. So our next step is to remove this brake line bracket off of our soft line and totally discard it. So what I'm going to do is actually make a notch in the back of here so we can pry it open. So Teraflex just says to pry it open, but it is pretty difficult since it is pretty structurally sound. So what I'm going to do is get our ABS line out of the way. Just going to wiggle it out of all of the brackets and put it to the side. And then what we can do is bend this up out of the way, grab a cutoff wheel, make a notch in the back of it, and then we can go ahead and pry it off. So I'm going to leave it attached to our control arm for now until it gives us trouble. We don't want to cut all the way through the bracket to the soft line. We just want to make sure that we make a notch so it's easier to pry back. All right, so once it has a decent notch in it, what we're gonna do is take a pair of channel locks and I am going to try to pry this open. Once the bracket's pried open enough, we can slip the soft line out and then remove the whole bracket from our control arm with a 15mm socket. So we're almost ready to drop our axle, but before we do that, I want to make sure that our brake lines and our breather hose are okay when we do that. So I'm going to take a trim removal tool and remove the clips that are holding our breather tube into our frame and our brake line bracket, so we can slide it down on the frame to make sure it's not being maxed out. So another thing before we want to drop our axle, this connector in the back has to be taken out. So I'm just going to take a trim removal tool, pull that tab back so we can disconnect that. And then this is going to be connected by clips as well. So I'm going to take the same trim removal tool and remove it from the axle as well as the frame. There's also going to be one that is on the upper control arm we can take out. So last but not least, before we drop our axle, I am going to remove this brake line bracket just to make sure that it's not maxed out. I'm using a 10mm socket. And we can just unhook it from the frame. Then you can do the same thing on the other side. So what we can do next after everything's disconnected from our axle is start to lower it down. So after our axle's low enough, what we can do is just pop our spring out of the retainer at the bottom and go ahead and remove it. So our next step is to remove our front lower control arms. I'm going to be using a 15/16 inch wrench for the nut side and a 21mm socket for the bolt head side. Right, once that bolt's removed, we can head up to the other side of our control arm. So we're going to use the same 15/16 inch wrench and 21mm socket to remove that top bolt. However, I would be mindful that once you loosen this up, the control arm will fall out of place. I'm just going to put my shoulder there to brace it. So last but not least, before we install our new suspension, what we need to do is take out our factory bump stops. And there are going to be tabs around the jounce tube that hold that bump stop in. So if it does not wiggle out right away, what you can do is take a flathead screwdriver and kind of pry it away from that tab. And same thing for the other side. So before we go ahead and install our new suspension system on our Wrangler, I did want to tell you guys a little bit more about it and what key benefits that you're getting from the Teraflex suspension over your factory components. Now, right off the bat, this is going to be a big upgrade overall. You're not only lifting your Wrangler, but you also are upgrading a lot of its performance as well. So starting off with the big key component that is really going to give you all of your ride quality out of your Wrangler, and that's the shocks. So you really have two schools of thought when it comes to shocks. You have a hydraulic shock and a gas charge shock. So a hydraulic shock is exactly what your factory shock is going to be, and that's going to give you a very comfortable and a fluid ride, and it's perfect for a daily driving and a light trail use application. However, when you start to go on harder trails, it can be susceptible to shock fade over time, which is cavitation or foaming forming inside the shock body, which will induce shock fade, and that is going to be basically a squishy shock, and you're not going to get some good good ride quality out of that. So a gas charged shock, on the other hand, like the Falcon monotube 2.1, is going to increase all of that performance. So it's going to reduce shock fade over time. So it is going to be a little bit stiffer than a hydraulic shock. However, that's going to be perfect for daily driving applications where you want to get rid of some of that body roll on the street. But it's also going to be tuned perfectly for trail performance, giving you a comfortable ride while you're bouncing out around the trails. Now, this is going to be street and trail performance, so it has that perfect split. They are not adjustable. They are perfectly tuned for that split between street and trail, and they're also going to be incredibly durable. So they're made of a 6061 T6 precipitation hardened aluminum alloy shock body. That's going to be able to take any hits on the trail if it has to, and the aluminum shock body is also going to do a really good job at dispersing any heat, keeping the shock performing at its highest efficiency, instead of the factory shock body, which is steel that doesn't do a great job at heat dissipation. And it's also going to have a 3/4 inch chrome hardened shaft, which is going to reduce any buckling and also be able to take a hit. So the shocks are going to be one of those big key components that you see out of this lift kit. However, there are also a lot of other components that are going to do the job as well. So you also have your springs, which are going to be a lot taller than your factory springs, giving you all of the height out of this lift kit. And then you are going to have some key components that are going to accommodate for that extra height, including your sway bar end links that you're getting with this kit that are going to be of a factory design. And you also are getting extended bump stops to accommodate for larger wheels and tires. So the other big thing that I really like about this lift kit is the fact that it comes with front lower control arms. So those are going to correct some of the caster and pinion angles that we messed up when we started lifting our Wrangler, and that's also going to eliminate any weird driving characteristics that we would have gotten if we left on our front lower control arms from the factory. So overall, this is a big upgrade, and you also are getting a lot of performance out of this lift kit in comparison to the factory components. So enough about these on the table, let's go ahead and install our new lift kit. So our first step to our new suspension is to install our new control arm. So we're going to put this in at the top mount, secure down our factory bolt, but we want to make sure that we tighten it down once the tape is on its own weight so we can make sure that the bushing is okay. So the thread on the nut on the other side. And then once that's secure, what we can do is connect the lower mount, but you're going to need somebody to pry on the axle to line up the control arm inside the mount. So we can repeat that process on the other side. So our next step before we put our spring in is to install our bump stop. Now this is going to be the skinnier bump stop, and we are going to take a couple of blocks of wood here and just press this into our jounce tube. So I'm just going to raise up the axle. I also did put a little bit of grease on the bump stop just to make it easier to go into the jounce tube. Right, after the bump stop's set in place, we can just do the same thing on the other side, and then we can install our new springs. So after you've installed your bump stops, you will need to install the lower bump stop extension if you have a 35 or a 37-inch tire that you're looking to pair with your Wrangler. Now there is a tire clearance guide in the Teraflex instructions, and it will differ depending on if you have a Rubicon, Sahara, and Sport, as well as the tire size that you're looking to put on your Wrangler. Now we're going to be running under a 33-inch tire. We're going to be running our stock wheels and tires, so we actually do not need to install these bump stop extensions. So what we can do next is install our springs. So now we can take our front springs and put that around the jounce tube and line them up in the spring perch, making sure that the pigtail sits in the spring retainer correctly. And do the same thing to the other side. So our next step is to install our shocks, and we're going to install these exactly how our factory ones came out with our factory bolts. So after you've cleared the liner and threaded in the bolt, what we can do is tighten that back down with an 18mm socket. I'm going to use a swivel socket since it is pretty high up. So now that we lined up the bottom of our shock with our shock mount, what we can do is secure it down with the factory bolt. You may have to tinker with the height of the axle, however, I would recommend that you keep an eye on your lift points. So after you have the bolt through and the nut threaded on, what we can do is tighten this down with an 18mm wrench and socket. Again, I'm going to be using a swivel socket because I don't have a lot of space. But you can do the same thing on the other side. So our next step is to install our sway bar end links in the front. Now these are going to be the shorter two out of the four that we can thread on the nylon lock nut and tighten that down with the same 18mm wrench and 6mm Allen socket that we use to take off the factory sway bar end links. So you might have to position your new sway bar end link into the passenger side mount with a dead blow or a mallet, but once it is in place, we can take our factory bolt and our factory flag nut and thread that into place. So after that's threaded into the flag nut, what we can do is tighten that down with the same 18mm socket. Again, I'm going to use a swivel socket. So you can do the same thing for the other side. So last but not least, we're just going to tie up a couple loose ends. We're going to reinstall our brake line brackets onto our frame using the factory hardware. I'm going to tighten that down with a 10mm socket. Last but not least, we need to make sure that this is plugged back in, so we can plug that back into the solenoid and set our clip, and then we can go ahead and head to the back. So now that we're finished up at the front, we can support our rear axle and start with our shock. So we're going to need an 18mm wrench and socket to take out our lower shock bolt. So in order to access our top shock bolt, what we need to do is remove this trim piece. There are 3 bolts that are holding it in. I'm going to use an 8mm socket to remove those. So now the top shock bolt is accessible, and we can take that out using an 18mm swivel socket. Then we can repeat that process on the other side. So next we can move on to our sway bar end length, starting with our bottom bolt. I'm going to be using an 18mm socket and wrench. So our next step, just like the front, is to remove the top part of our sway bar end link. I'm going to be using that same 6mm Allen socket and an 18mm wrench to take that nut off. Then we can repeat that process on the other side. So after we have our sway bar end lengths out, we do want to disconnect our track bar from the axle side, and I'm going to be using a 21mm socket. So our next step is going to be to remove our brake line bracket from our frame. Again, I'm going to use a 10mm socket. This is just going to give us some slack when we drop our axle. So while we're over on the passenger side, we can take out our stock bump stop. We're going to do the same thing with a flathead screwdriver and pry on the tab there. We can wiggle it out of the jounce tube. So our next step is to drop our axle and take out our springs, but we want to make sure that our breather hose is not being maxed out. So I'm just going to quickly remove that by just pinching this clamp with a pair of pliers and wiggling it off of our axle. So what we have to do next is reroute our e-brake cable underneath our cross member here, but first we have to take off the bracket that's holding it to the body of the Wrangler. So I'm going to use a 13mm socket as well as a 10-inch extension to reach up in between the fuel lines and remove that bolt and that bracket. So after we've removed that bracket, what we can do is unhook our e-brake cable. I'm going to use a pair of pliers to pull this out a little bit from the hub here, while simultaneously unhooking the line. So our next step is to remove this from this bracket here. Now this is going to have a couple of different tabs on it that we have to depress in order to slide this back and out. So I'm going to use a couple of flathead screwdrivers, depress those tabs, and wiggle the line out. Now we can just route this above the fuel lines and underneath of our crossbar and our field lines. So after it's rerouted underneath, we can just go ahead and reconnect our e-brake cable. So now we can install our spring, making sure that we have our factory isolator on top. And then we can do the other side and raise up our axle. So we can do the same thing for the other side, and we will have to raise up the axle in order to get this to sit in place correctly. So at this point, if you are installing your bump stop extensions, you will need the bump stop extension for the back plate here, as well as the spacers and the plate, as well as the threaded nut plate. So what essentially you're gonna do is install this on the bottom, put your spacer or however many spacers you need between, and then your bump stop extension on top. Put your threaded nut plate inside the bump stop extension, and then you can put bolts up through the top and thread it into place. Now again, we don't need to install these, so we're gonna move on to our next step. So before we go ahead and install our shocks and our sway bars, we do want this room open in order to install our track bar relocation bracket. So what I'm gonna do is just place this down over our factory track bar bracket. Actually gonna take a dead blow and make sure that that's in position, because we have to drill 2 holes on the outside. So what I'm gonna do to make sure that this is as accurate as possible is just place a bolt, the provided bolt that Teraflex gives you, through the track bar bracket and the factory track bar bracket, and then we can make sure that this is lined up correctly. So what I'm gonna do is take a marker and mark where the holes are. So then we can take this bracket off. So now that the holes are marked, we can go ahead and drill 2 half-inch holes. Now I am gonna mark the center of the hole with a center punch. And I am gonna drill a pilot hole for each of these for our step bit. So I have a 3/16 inch drill bit, and I'm gonna drill 2 pilot holes. So now that both holes are drilled, what we can do is reinstall our bracket. Then we can install our provided hardware. So now we can tighten down our hardware with a 16mm socket and an 18mm wrench. So now we can install our sleeve inside our bracket at the factory location with our provided bolt and washer. Then we can also attach our track bar at our top location with the provided bolt. So if it doesn't line up in the back, what I recommend to do is just grab a pry bar and push up on the track bar. That should kind of straighten it out, and then you can take a dead blow and push the bolt through. So what we can do next is tighten down this bottom bolt and the crush sleeve inside with a 18mm socket and a 13/16 inch wrench for the nut side on the back. So we will be tightening down the top bolt on the ground while the Jeep is on its own weight so we don't tear the bushing. So now we can head to our sway bar end links. So our next step is to install our sway bar end link. Now we're gonna put the standard bushing at the top and our ball and joint bushing down at the bottom. Then we can take our factory bolt, put that through our sway bar end link into our sway bar, and then thread that into place. Once that's tightened down, what we can do is thread on the nylon lock nut down at the bottom. We can tighten that up with a 6mm Allen socket and a 19mm wrench. Then we can repeat that process on the other side. So before we install our shocks, we're going to reattach our brake line brackets using our factory bolt. And I'm going to tighten that down with a 10mm socket. And then we can do the same thing on the other side and then install our shocks. So next we can install our shock in the factory location with the factory bolt. Then we can tighten that down with an 18mm socket. So while we're here, we can reinstall our plastic trim piece. And then we can tighten them down with our 8mm socket. And then do the same thing on the other side. So once you have the shock in place, you can go ahead and thread on the nut and tighten it down with an 18mm socket and wrench. Same thing for the other side. So So our last step is to reinstall our axle side track bar bolt. Now you will have to have somebody jump in the driver's seat and turn the wheel left to right to line this up in order to get that bolt in, but once it's in and the flag nut is on the other side, we can tighten it down with a 21mm socket, and I'm also using an extension to clear the drag link again. So we can tighten up our control arm since the Jeep is on its own weight using a 15/16 inch wrench and a 21mm socket. Last but not least, we want to make sure that our track bar bolt is tightened down since the Jeep is on its own weight. So I'm going to use an 18mm socket and a 1/2 inch drive ratchet, as well as a 13/16 inch wrench. So after you're finished tightening down your control arms as well as your track bars, I would recommend to get an alignment as well as torque everything down to spec. So that's going to wrap it up for my review and install. Make sure you like and subscribe, and for more videos and products like this, always keep it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.